Just before we begin, if you're looking for full case study packs, mock exams, even free resources, head over to vivatuition.com. You'll find some of the best price SEMA offers on the market, and we've been getting really great feedback from our students on our materials. In our recent August survey, for example, we received an average satisfaction rating of 4.6 out of 5, compared to an average of 3.1 for other tuition providers. You can also subscribe free for access to a case study mini pack and financial ratios document for the November case. And one last thing, all our packs come with a lifetime pass guarantee as standard, so you can find all the details over on our website.
We start with the job description, where you're told that you're a finance officer for Struans of Newland, and your role consists of supporting the senior finance officer. We'll be introduced to the organogram later on for the company, and we'll see that the senior finance officer is this person called Enid Chang, and Enid is then reporting directly into the finance director, James Struan. So your role consists of helping out with the production of the annual budget, producing the monthly management accounts, and providing information to senior management on an ad hoc basis whenever it's required. So a very short introduction here, but there are a couple of things that it's important to point out. The first thing to point out is that you are in a support role. In other words, you assist the key decision makers in this company, the key decision makers being the senior management team. And most of that management team, as we will see shortly, are members of the Struan family. This is a family-run business. There are pros and cons that come with a family-run business, and we'll talk about those later on. So you're supporting the main actors in the business at later levels in your SEMA studies, at management level, at strategic level especially. You will be the one actually taking the key decisions and making those key strategic decisions for the long-term benefit of the company. But at the operational level, what you're doing is you're feeding the key decision makers key information to support their strategic decision making. Your role is quite varied. You can be called upon in this exam to help out in a number of different areas, and primarily you'll be dealing with fellow finance colleagues, so you can expect plenty of triggers on exam day to be initiated by Enid Chang, the senior finance officer, perhaps fellow finance officers, or even on occasion James Struan, who is the finance director. And this has implications for the way you communicate with these colleagues, because of the fact that they're finance colleagues, you can assume they have a certain amount of financial technical knowledge, and you can communicate them using financial jargon. It's different if you're dealing with non-finance colleagues, and you're expected to bear that in mind for the case study exam. If you're dealing with, for example, a marketing colleague, you can't assume that they know what a certain accounting standard means or consists of, so you need to unpack technical financial terms for those people. It's not necessary to do that to the same extent when you're dealing with a finance colleague, and most of your interactions are likely to be with fellow finance colleagues in the operational case study. For that reason, technical skills are of paramount importance in the operational case study. Technical skills, you'll remember that there are 4 skills examined: technical skills, business skills, people skills, and leadership skills. And technical skills account for a massive 64% of the marks assigned here. So you need to go back over your E1, P1 and F1 main theories, your main standards, your main calculations, etc., and ensure that you're comfortable with those. There's not going to be any new technical skill required for the case study, but you'll certainly be expected to be quite fluent in those technical areas. And a lot of people have the doubt about whether they're going to be asked to do lots of intricate calculations on exam day when it comes to the operational case study? And the answer to that is no, you won't be expected to do long, drawn-out calculations. What is far more likely to happen is that you'll be presented with a table, for example, of calculations, and you'll have to interpret them. So you might get a table outlining a net present value type calculation for 2 or 3 strategic options, and you'll be expected to comment on what those figures and categories mean. So that is the kind of technical skill that you'll need to demonstrate at the operational case study. A word then on your role. So you're a finance officer at this company. You're quite low down the food chain, and your role will be fixated on a short-term focus. So you're likely to be taking decisions that affect the company 6 months out, 1 year out, but not much beyond that. That contrasts with the higher levels management and strategic case study levels, where the focus is more on the long term, where you're talking about decisions that would impact the company 3 to 5 years out. Some big areas at the operational case study relate to costing. Okay, we know that this company, we'll look at that later on, is employing absorption costing, so more traditional form of costing. You might be expected to contrast that with activity-based costing on exam day, for example. Budgets are going to be important. This particular case study has a full budget listed for 2017, and we'll look at that in detail when we come to it. Variance analysis then linked to the budget, so it's quite likely on exam day that one or more of the variants of the exam that you'll be presented with would present you with a table, for example, showing the standards or budgeted information, and they contrast it with actuals from a 3-month, a 6-month period, and you'll be expected to comment on sales variances and things like that. That's quite a typical question to get, so make sure you're comfortable with that. And then thinking about F1, you'll be thinking about working capital management, and that's going to be an important consideration for this particular case because the working capital has decreased between 2015 and 16, and that has implications for this case in particular, so we'll comment on that when we come to the financial statements. Cash management is going to be an important consideration here too. And finally, risk assessments in the short term and how you manage and treat risk is going to be important to consider too. So they're all areas that if you're reviewing your E1, P1 and F1 theory, keep those especially in mind because they tend to come up more frequently than other areas. We turn next then to the company background, and we've plenty to look at here. We're told that Struans is a family business based in Milltown in the country of Newland. So we know nothing about Newland or indeed Milltown. We don't even know if it's the capital city of Newland or not. And Newland, really we're not told very much. We are told that it has its own currency, the Newland dollar. So we ask the question as to whether this is a company that is doing exports and has a big volume of imports. With exports, we have reason to believe that absolutely no, they are not exporting their product to other countries. Imports, there is a likelihood, I would say, that they are importing because they're relying on commodities like sugar. That's a very, very important input for this company. So it's likely that they're dealing with imports. So that would have implications on how they manage their currency reserves. Are they trying to hedge exposure to currency risk, etc.? They're questions worth asking right now. Returning then to the point about Newland and what we know about it, or rather what we don't know about it. We know very little about the socioeconomic status of this country. The tendency is, in a lot of these case studies where you're given a fictional country, the tendency is to try to draw comparisons with real-life countries. That's more possible in other case studies that I've seen in the past. In this one, we're given so little information that it's very difficult to draw some comparison with a real country. What I would say is, later on in the case study, there are indeed hints that this may be a developed country because of the fact that they talk about this move away from high-fat products, a move to more organic products, an emphasis on fair trade. These are consumer considerations in more developed countries that we've seen in recent years. So for that reason, I would estimate that New Land is perhaps a developed country too. But I would be cautious about taking it much further than that. I don't think we can make a full assumption that New Land is a fully developed country, but this is based on what I see later on in the case study. Just something to bear in mind. We are told that the company was founded in 1912, so over 100 years old. So this is a company with staying power. Presumably it's seen all sorts of challenges throughout that time frame, and it's shown itself to be a survivor, so that augurs well for future challenges that the company will be facing undoubtedly. And it is diversified from dairy farming into milk retailing and later on into the manufacturing of ice cream, and that's where it's placed now. It's an ice cream producer. So that leads me to think that this is a company that has staying power, as I said, that perhaps they're quite comfortable with risk. The fact that they have diversified. Think about your E1 studies and Ansof's matrix, where you're presented with the possibility of entering new markets and new products, or staying in your current market and offering your current products. The most risky strategy that you can pick from the four that Ansof presents is diversification, new products, new markets, and this is what Struans has demonstrated in the past. So they've been comfortable with risk. They've pivoted the company to go into new areas, and that again is a good sign, and I think it's something that might be important in the future as well. So in the 1930s, they were developing they were a dairy farm in Milltown. Then, in fact, they moved into milk retailing, and they became a substantial business in that area. And later on, 56 years later, in 1986, what they found was that they had actually a big cream surplus, and they shifted from being a milk retailer into an ice cream producer because they had this excess of cream due to a shift in the marketplace from full cream milk to semi-skimmed milk. So that shows a nice ability to pivot and to adapt in spite of market challenges. So long-standing company with a history of adapting to shifting consumer tastes. And those shifting consumer tastes are evident in this particular case study that we'll see later on when we look at the industry. And what happened was they started up their dairy ice cream operation in 1986. They started very small, and they actually rapidly expanded. And that again shows that the company has staying power and has an ability to expand. We asked the question, thinking about our F1 studies, about how they financed this rapid expansion. Was it through debt? Was it through the issuance of shares or some other way? And of course, there are dangers as well as opportunities presented with a rapid expansion. There's the danger perhaps of over trading, doing too much too quickly. And in fact, I have reason to believe when we turn to the financial statements that this is a company that may be over trading in the present moment. More on that later on. We go to the next paragraph then, and what we're told is that they have actually established themselves as the leading premium dairy ice cream brand in New Land. So they're recognized for their high quality and their innovative flavors. So we think about your E1 studies and the marketing mix, the 4 Ps: price, promotion, product in place, and there is scope to charge a premium price. They've got a premium product, and that justifies looking for a premium price. But the pricing actually in this pre-scene is an interesting consideration because there are market forces that are depressing the possibility of charging premium prices, and we'll talk about that in a little while. They're producing 11 million litres of dairy ice cream per year. They're generating revenues of 21 million N dollars. So about $2 N dollars per litre is a rough estimation of their price per litre. So there are 4 different ranges, we're told, and they have several tub sizes and flavours. And the category in the industry that Struans falls into is the bulk category, because their smallest tub size is 500 millilitres, and in fact they go all the way up to 2 litres. So they've got a 500 millilitre offering, a 1 litre offering, and a 2 litre offering as well. So this is categorised as bulk. So there are a number of different ranges that Struans offers. They've got single flavour ice cream. This is your traditional vanilla, chocolate, etc. They have multiple flavoured ice cream. Then they have chunks, which include these hard chunks of sweet like honeycomb, jelly beans, chocolate chip, etc. And they have exotic fruit dairy ice cream as well. And the biggest volumes are represented in the single flavour and multiple flavour ice creams. We'll see that later on when we look at the budgeting information. So they're very reliant on those 2 in particular. But in fact, it's the chunks and exotic flavour ice creams that have the highest gross profit margins, which again we will see when we turn to the budget information later on. So I would say this company is offering, when you think about your E1 studies again, you think of Porter's generic strategies, whether a company could be a cost leader or differentiated, or indeed have a niche focus. This is a company, I would say, that's differentiating themselves. They're going for a high premium quality offer, probably fixated on quite a relatively small part of the market. They're differentiated, and as I said before, it's important that they're able then to justify probably higher production costs, etc., with a higher premium price. More on that later on. Then a little bit about where their production takes place. They have their own dairy farm, and in fact, so that dairy farm has got 1,500 acres and 450 cows. You're probably thinking, well, okay, what does that mean? As always, it's important to put numbers in context to see what they mean. To give you an idea, the 1,500 acres, the average US large family farm has about 1,421 acres. So that's very much in line with this kind of with the farm that Struans has. So we would classify it perhaps as a large family farm. 450 cow dairy herd. To give you an idea, the average UK dairy farm has about 143 cows. So quite a bit bigger than that. So I would classify it as a large family farm, but not at all on the scale of large industrial farms that you see quite commonly in the dairy industry, for example, and they're becoming more and more commonplace. So this is a big family-run business. They rely on renewable energy power for their dairy farm, and that has implications for not just their cost savings and things like that, but for their corporate social responsibilities. There are fewer externalities, negative externalities for stakeholders to have to deal with, and that bolsters this company's green credentials, which is becoming more and more important. And actually, this is a brand differentiator in an industry where there is price pressure coming from supermarkets, which we'll see later on. It means that there is less of a scope, perhaps, for these ice cream producers to differentiate their brand, because the supermarkets have so much power. And one of the ways they can differentiate their brand is through their green credentials. There are 60 staff operating this business, and many of those staff have been with the company for a very long time, indeed 20 years. So very, very low turnover rate, it would seem. Probably this is a loyal staff, relatively satisfied staff as well. And one of the questions I would ask right now is whether these are all full-time staff or whether there are part-time staff included here. The reason I ask this is because ice cream is quite a cyclical business. It relies on seasonal sales. You're going to see more sales in the summer when it's warm, etc. And that means if you have full-time staff, there is a possibility that they're going to be somewhat idle for parts of the year, in the winter months, for example. So is there a degree of waste there where staff are just sitting around in the winter months not doing very much? It also has this kind of business raises questions about demand and how they're managing their inventory, how they're managing their production. Is it constant, or are they trying to tailor their production to the peaks and troughs in demand? And then in the last paragraph, we're told about the generations of the Struan family who've developed the business over the decades, and the current generation is actually very heavily involved. Gavin Struan is the managing director, he's the head honcho, and he's a very popular local businessman. And the current generation has been pivotal in the growth of the company, and they have ensured the long-term survival of the company through regularly updating the range of flavors available. So that is a key differentiator for this firm and a key driver of their growth, and it's ensured their long-term survival. So this is a company with high-quality ice cream. They're innovative in terms of the flavors they offer. And the siblings, there are 3 of them, Ian, James, and Hannah. They all hold senior management positions in the company. Couple of things then to mention about family companies. There are pros and cons, as with any other type of company structure. The pros relate to family companies tending to take more of a long-term view. There aren't open to the same pressures as, for example, a publicly listed company where there are shareholder pressures, etc., for short-term profitability. The family companies tend to want to take a long-term view. They're thinking about future generations. They're thinking probably about their own family, their own children, taking on the burden of running the company in the future. So they want to leave it in good shape for their children. And there's a degree perhaps of solidarity that exists in family companies, brothers and sisters operating side by side. There are blood ties, obviously, that bind them, and they're likely to perhaps treat their siblings more fairly. Now, that isn't always the case, because indeed there are, and this leads me to the potential cons of a family company, there is scope for tremendous resentment among family members. When things go wrong in a family company, they can go really wrong and turn really, really nasty. And you see families breaking up over fights for control of family-run companies. Another con would be that family-run companies tend to be a little bit more conservative. They can be resistant to change. They operate under the notion that, well, things have always worked this way, therefore they will always work this way, and that can be an erroneous way to think. And of course, a big con is nepotism. This is favouring family members for senior positions. And right at the outset, we have to ask, based on this last paragraph that we've just seen, whether that's the case at Struans. Look at all the senior management positions being occupied by the Struan family members. We have to ask, are they the right people? Are they sufficiently qualified? Have they got the right experience to hold those senior positions? If they don't, the company might run the risk of being run into the ground by ill-qualified people. It seems that Struans is a privately owned company, and that has pros and cons as well. It means that if they are a privately owned company, and I have reason to believe that they are, there's no mention that they're stock listed or anything like that throughout this pre-scene. There will be no public pressure, no shareholder pressure. There aren't the same onerous regulations from the stock market in terms of publishing financial statements and having them audited, etc. There isn't the same inspection from the marketplace as there would be for a publicly listed company, but there are more limited financing options for a family-run company that is privately owned. What about the product itself then? We're told, first of all, that the elements that go into the product, the ice cream product, are somewhat determined by government legislation. And you think of your E1 studies there, regulation being a key component of a government's repertoire. And a government is going to be interested in businesses acting in the public interest. They're not so concerned, well, they are concerned to an extent about private company profits, because of course that gives them corporation tax being paid over, etc., which impacts the government's ability to spend. But they have a big fixation on representing the public interest. So what does the government say? Well, to use the term ice cream, you need a mix of ingredients that contain a minimum of 5% dairy fat. And to use the term dairy ice cream, which is like a higher grade of ice cream, your mix of ingredients must contain at least 10% dairy fat. But in fact, premium labels have between 10 and 16% of dairy fat, and the highest quality ice creams contain about 20% dairy fat. And in fact, we learn in a little while that Struans is even over that high threshold. They've got 21% dairy fat. So, typical dairy ice cream mix contains the following ingredients, determined by the percentage of the total weight that they represent. Dairy fat being 10 to 16% on average, and that is comprised of cream or butter fat. Milk solids then represent about 9 to 12%, sweeteners 12 to 16%, stabilizers and emulsifiers a very minimal percentage, and water being actually the biggest percent, and that's coming from milk and other ingredients. So the items that a company like Struans is actually importing or having supplied to them by external suppliers is only about 12.2 to 16.5%. Everything else is produced in-house. The dairy fat, the milk solids, the water, that's all coming from Struans themselves. So they're less reliant on external suppliers than other companies might be. Sugar there is going to be a big input. That's coming externally, and we're told in a while that sugar prices, the problem with them is that they're actually very volatile. So they need to see how they manage the purchase of that key ingredient. Now, a couple of things to note. Dietary trends in developed countries especially have seen a turn against fat, and they've seen anti-sugar rhetoric as well in recent times. And indeed, there is recognition of lactose intolerance. All of that stands against an ice cream manufacturer, and they need to be aware of those trends and changes in consumer taste. And we'll see plenty about that later in the pre-scene. A word again then on the government, and you think of Mendelow's matrix, which you were introduced to in your E1 studies. And for me, the government in this industry is certainly high power, but probably low interest. They're not going to be getting too concerned about what a company like Struans is up to, as long as they're not producing goods that are potentially harmful to the public. So it's all about keeping the government off your back, keeping them satisfied, and you shouldn't have too many problems. So the basic mix that we see there, the dairy fat, the milk solids, the sweeteners, the stabilizers and emulsifiers and the water, to that basic mix, you're adding flavorings and chunks to produce a variety of different ice cream flavors. During the freezing process, we're told that air is being added. Okay, and what the air does is it actually increases the volume, but not the weight. And this is known in the industry as overrun. And for example, you might start off with a 1 litre mix and you make 1.5 litres of dairy ice cream. You've increased the volume by 50% by pumping air into it. You inflate it. So there's a 50% overrun. And the more overrun that you have, generally the lower quality ice cream that you have as well. So higher quality products have lower overrun. The average overrun is around 35%, but this is actually as much as 50% for soft ice cream. So a good rule of thumb is the softer the ice cream, the lower the quality. You think about your own experience with ice cream. I know when I go into my local ice cream parlor, which produces or is reputed to produce very high quality ice cream, it's much harder. There's less overrun altogether than you would get with a tub that you might get in a supermarket for, an own brand type tub, which is going to be really, really soft. And that's because there's a lot of air pumped into it to puff it up. And the result is there's a lot of overrun with those cheaper ice creams. This has cost implications for packaging. If you're pumping air into the ice cream, you're going to need bigger containers, and you're going to have to spend more on packaging. So, that counteracts the cost savings there. And perhaps it could be used to justify a higher price. We've got 1.5 litres for sale here with lots of overrun. I think not, though, that it's not so easy to trick consumers. They know that what they're getting when they buy ice cream, whether it's good quality or low quality in general. And we're told then in the last paragraph here that Struans is manufacturing very high quality premium ice cream, 21% dairy fat, so they exceed the threshold for the highest quality ice cream there. And their overrun is just 20%, well below the industry average of 35%. So higher quality, we would assume, implies higher production costs. But I'm a little bit worried because there is price pressure coming from the buyers of Struans ice cream. The main buyers are supermarkets. They have enormous buyer power, and that's going to put a squeeze on profit margins.